Wes, you just mentioned inerrancy. Obviously, that's a doctrine that is subject to misunderstanding. How would you encourage pastors to talk about what inerrancy is and isn't, and why is it still such an important doctrine?
Yeah, I think it's important because I think that everyone should take Jesus's view of Scripture. And I think inerrancy is what Jesus's view of Scripture was. So you look at somewhere like Matthew 22, where Jesus is verbally sparring with the Sadducees, and they're trying to trap him on a question about the resurrection. And in the course of the conversation, Jesus makes this really interesting phrase where he says, "Have you not read what God spoke to you saying?" And then he goes on to quote Moses. And it's a little bit awkwardly stated in both the Greek and the English, because he should say, "Have you not read what God wrote to you?" Or "Have you not heard what God spoke to you?" But that's not what he says. He says, "Have you not read what God spoke to you?" And it's as if he's holding his original audience accountable, as if when they're reading the Scripture that God has spoken directly to them, that they are the first audience. And like I said before, he goes on to quote Exodus, and though the Sadducees aren't standing at the base of Mount Sinai hearing God's voice via Moses, Jesus is beholding them to that as if they were. And so first and foremost, I think if we're going to claim to be Christians, we should at minimum hold the view that Christ held in regards to what inspiration and inerrancy was. And so I think ultimately what I'd say is that inerrancy is a statement on the origin of Scripture, is that Scripture comes from God, and because God does not err, neither does his word. And so I think that's communicated from the pages of Scripture itself, but you can look at individuals throughout church history. Augustine, when he's conversing with the Manichaeans in his back and forth, he writes to Jerome, and he says that this heretical Gnostic sect who asserts that Augustine's view of inspiration is contradictory. Well, Augustine says simply that there are no contradictions within Scripture because no author has erred. And that if you find what looks like a mistake in Scripture, it's either your misunderstanding of the text, or the translation you're looking at is poor, or you're reading some sort of scribal error. And none of any of that impacts the original words inspirationally penned by the authors of Scripture. And so in more recent times, you read something like RPC and A.T. Hanson's book on the Bible without illusions. Is that what it's called?
That's what it's called.
Yeah, and though those two are neither necessarily friendly to historic Protestant evangelicalism, they're very early on in the book, they state that something like biblical inerrancy is just the Christian reality.
Right.
That their contention is not that Christians haven't believed this, but it's simply that it's outdated, and that people shouldn't believe it because, we've grown up from all that outdated silliness. But I think what that testifies to is that this is a view that is part of the historic church. And I don't know how you could trust that God is trustworthy, but not trust that his words are trustworthy. And so I would ultimately say that it's a hill we can die on in terms of what Scripture is, that Scripture is truthful in what it claims to be truthfully saying. And so there are some caveats to that. There are some things that we might assert Scripture is saying that it's not intending to say, but that's why good exegesis and hermeneutics is so important. But these are things that, haven't necessarily been part of, say, the toolkit of the apologist necessarily, but I think are things that I said recently on a biblical languages podcast that I was featured on, where they asked me, what are the most important things you have found apologetically that have helped you in your study? And I have no qualm saying it's studying the biblical languages in church history, because almost always an objection to the Christian faith comes down to some sort of misunderstanding in regards to bad exegesis or hermeneutics, or a complete just misapprehension or complete made up story about church history. The reason we continue to hear that Constantine is the boogeyman and that everything happened at the Council of Nicaea is because people just don't have the basic comprehension and literacy of what actually did happen at the Council of Nicaea. And so that's where I think it's important to, when we are called to give an answer for the hope that we have, and do so with gentleness and respect, understanding Scripture, and Scripture first and foremost, as the words of God, and being able to communicate that if God is trustworthy, his word is too.